I remember the first time I was able to ward off a panic attack. I moved to tears now, still thinking about it. I didn't kill myself. I was there. I was still taking up space, and I was on that street corner, and I was trying to figure it out. And I became so profoundly grateful.
What's up, everyone? This is Justin Kahn. Welcome to my podcast, The Quest, where I dive into the ups and downs of trailblazers around me to help you figure out life and where you want to be. Before we start, bang that subscribe button for unfiltered conversations on tech, wellness, and entertainment dropping every Tuesday. My guest today is Jewel, four-time Grammy-nominated singer, songwriter, actress, and author who sold over 30 million albums worldwide. When I read her book, Never Broken, I thought to myself, this is an incredible story, and I really want to have her on the podcast. I learned a lot from our conversation, and I hope you can take away some things that you can apply to your own life. Jewel, tell me about writing your book and how you got started, why you wanted to do it. Where did the impetus come from?
Writing's always helped me process pain. When I was young, my mom left when I was 8. My dad took over raising us in Alaska, and we started bar singing to make a living. And we did 5-hour sets in different bars all across Alaska. And, you know, when you're young, you see patterns really clearly. You know, kids see so much more than we give them credit for as adults. But what I basically saw was people in pain, and people trying to handle pain. And the way it looked to me, I'm a really visual thinker, I guess. I see in pictures. And so I saw like this grain of sand, I guess you could say, of pain. And then I saw people trying to avoid that pain through different types of actions. I saw people drinking and doing drugs and rage and sex and all kinds of stuff. And it was very clear that it never worked. They never avoided pain. And in fact, they just kept heaping these layers of avoidance, which was more pain on top of the original pain. And I watched people die. You know, I watched people die of alcoholism. I watched people die that couldn't afford coffins, you know, and we would sing in the parking lot of the bar as a fundraiser to buy a coffin for these poor souls. And I just remember and my dad was drinking, and he was clearly in a lot of pain. He started being abusive to me and my brothers at that age. And so I remember thinking, why aren't we taught what to do with pain? I know I was in a lot of pain, but I made myself this promise that I would try and handle the pain as it came. You know, that was kind of the only true shortcut that life offered, was dealing with it right away. And at the time, you know, I was really young. I didn't quite have all this language around it, but I realized that when I wrote, I felt better. I realized I could definitely tell my body felt a little better, and it took that pain down a little bit. And so that's what I turned to. And then I was amazed that every time I wrote, I saw patterns I didn't know I saw. I had insights I didn't know that I had, and I just kept writing, not because I thought it would be a living, but because it just made me feel better. It made me see things, and seeing things when you're scared and young and vulnerable feels powerful, empowering. And so it's what I've always done to get through pain, basically. And when I was 40, I was going through a divorce, and I was in a lot of pain. And so I turned to writing, and writing that book as a way to process what I was going through. And also because, you know, at 40, I knew everybody deals with a lot of pain, and a lot of people don't think they can get through it, and we can. And I wanted to share enough of my story that other people understand that we can do this. It really doesn't take a particularly special talent to get through pain. It just takes a certain type of stubbornness, a willingness to keep standing up and asking yourself one simple question. And this question's a hard question, but do you want to die? Because that's going to tell you a plan of action. If you want to die, you're going to have to make a real specific plan. You know, that's going to take a real specific plan to handle that. If you don't want to die, that's going to take a real specific plan to handle that. For me, for whatever reason, I never wanted to die. And that meant I had to ask myself the next question, which is, what am I going to do different today than I did yesterday? And can I take notes on it and see if it works? So writing that book was my process of helping myself through that experience, as well as trying to write it in a way that gave people some insight of what to do with pain, because I've had to deal with a lot of it.
I love that part of your book where you were kind of talking about your time singing in bars. And I think one of the things you wrote, I took notes. I was like, I love to observe people. I watch love and life play out in a million ways. But one of the best things I learned was this: you don't outrun pain. And I highlighted that because it was such a amazing lesson to learn. I mean, probably a very difficult lesson, but it seemed like such an important lesson to learn when you were really young, right, at the time. Like, how old were you when you were singing in these bars?
It started at age 8. Yeah, the buffalo is the only animal that goes directly into the storm. And that image really struck me, that the quickest way is through. The quickest way is through. Avoidance, everybody's obsessed with hacks now. You don't get to hack spirituality. You don't get to hack pain. The
Yeah.
only genuine shortcut is going toward what you're uncomfortable with. And if you can recalibrate that, you start moving toward uncomfortable things, moving toward your anxiety, moving toward the uncomfortable parts of your personality, and you start to look at them with curiosity, that's the only genuine shortcut.
It took me a long time to learn that. Like, I think I started learning that when I was in my late 20s and early 30s. Were you able to apply that to your life when you were that young? Because you were dealing with a lot of pain, right? You were dealing with, your dad, your mom left, your dad was drinking and abusive sometimes. How did you kind of process and know all that then, or was that something that took you a while to learn?
My languaging around it is obviously much different now. At the time, I think when I was 8, I just knew you couldn't avoid pain. I knew that. I knew you couldn't outrun it. And I promised myself to try and handle it as it came, which I didn't have great skills for, but telling the truth was a big part of that. Now, I only did it in a notebook. I'd started lying a lot at that age. I started stealing at that age. So it wasn't like my behaviors were great or perfect, but I was lying to try and make myself seem more lovable than I was, to seem more perfect than I was. We all kind of start to do that. We all start to alter our authenticity in an effort to be accepted. When you're raised in an abusive household, you're trying to figure out that puzzle of why isn't he nice to me? But I realized, I remember, it's funny. I remember where I was walking up these stairs in this little cabin I was raised in. And I was struck by this image of Hansel and Gretel. And I was like, if I keep lying, I won't remember who I am. And it paralyzed me. That thought scared me immensely. And I thought about like breadcrumbs back to who I was as I was starting to construct this other version of who I was. And I went to writing again. And so I made this promise that I would always tell the truth in one place. It's funny, it brings tears to my eyes, and that it would be in my notebook. And nobody ever read that notebook, but I told the truth there. And it was hard, but what a skill to build on later, because that ended up being a very foundational thing. Just like the idea of not trying to outrun pain became a foundational thing. So I didn't know what to do with these pieces yet, but for some reason, intuitively, I knew that these things, my survival depended on them. It felt that way.
And it sounded like from your book that through your life, you've had all of these adaptive mechanisms of control to like give your, I guess, I think you wrote it as like brilliant resilience, but it sounds like things like stealing or lying were ways to try to adapt to your environment. And can you talk about like some of those things that you learned and, how they served you? One thing I really loved is like you wrote about them serving you at some points in your life, and then at other points in your life, later in your life, you realized, oh, this behavior isn't serving me anymore. And that really resonated for me because, I felt like in my life, I had all of these things that I wanted to impress other people or be, big deal. And so I like really worked hard and tortured myself about like trying to be successful. And then at a certain point, I was successful and I was like, why am I, I'm torturing myself every day about this, like inside, mentally, why am I doing it? It's not serving me anymore.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your process with that throughout your life.
Yeah. Psychologically, we all want love. We know intuitively, instinctively, animalistically that we depend on connection for our survival. We need to connect. If we don't know how to connect in healthy ways, we'll try to unconnect in less than healthy ways. We don't really know that. It's not like a real conscious thing, but it's just the ingeniousness of our ability to survive. We will get our needs met, whether it's through healthy or unhealthy means. We will try to get our needs met, and we'll do the best we can. Some of them are, what we would classically call the coping mechanism that aren't great. Stealing's not a great coping mechanism. It did make me feel in control. It made me feel like I was caring for myself. It really was an honest, as funny as that sounds, attempt to meet my needs in the best way I knew how. It just wasn't a great way. But I had to learn to look at my behaviors with a lot of kindness and compassion, even though I wasn't raised with those two things, because otherwise you don't get to see them. You start to hide from yourself, right? Your own psyche camouflages your behaviors from yourself because you're so judgmental and so shaming of your own behaviors that you can never stop to look at your behaviors, because psychologically it's dangerous. Basically, if you're so mean to yourself that you're going to beat yourself up the second you see a behavior, you're not going to ever see your behaviors. So learning again to use writing, suspending judgment, and using pure observation helped me start seeing some of these patterns that were unhealthy, like negative coping mechanisms. I didn't know what to do with them right away, but I could see them. And at least I knew they weren't great. I wasn't kidding myself about them, but I also didn't know how to abstain. And then I realized there was a time, I think it's when I was homeless, that I started to look at those negative patterns as a triad. I called them a triad. I realized there was 3 steps. There was a before, a during, and an after. The before, something scared me. We would now use the word triggered. And then there was a behavior, stealing. I could see that. And then there was an after. I got a reward. It's actually called a habit loop. I didn't know that at the time. And so being homeless was scary, triggered me. I behaved by stealing because that made me feel in control and nurtured. And then my reward was a biochemical rush. And so I realized to change this habit loop, meditation isn't enough. Meditation's great. All mindfulness is being consciously present. But what are you going to do with it? It's like getting your car out of 5th gear or off of autopilot, getting it into neutral. Neutral won't take your car somewhere else new. It's an important first step to getting somewhere new. So meditation alone isn't enough. And I started realizing that when I was 18, that I had to create things that created new patterns. And this idea of nature versus nurture. And could I re-nurture myself? Could I rewire myself? And so I looked at that triad, and I couldn't change being homeless right away, but I could change my behavior. And so I went back to writing, because that was just one thing that had been really consistent in my life. But it wasn't real exciting. When I wrote, the types of neurochemicals my body received were calmative. They weren't excitatory. And so it didn't feel as exciting, but I actually that was where will comes in. I forced myself not to steal, Now it takes mindfulness. There's a process to it. I can talk to you about it. It doesn't happen overnight, because my awareness didn't grow overnight. I was so disassociated and so anxious all the time that I sometimes didn't consciously wake up until after I'd stolen something. It was kind of like, oh my God, I did it again. Yeah. Because some part of me was just on this autopilot drive, especially when I got triggered. Then with awareness, learning to practice being aware, which, I just created these little exercises. I can talk about that separately, but then I started noticing while I was stealing, but I didn't want to stop. I still stole it, but I was aware I was doing it, and that was progress. Then I started to notice before I wanted to steal something, but I couldn't stop it. I still stole it, but at least I was gaining awareness. Then the very last step was noticing when that feeling was coming of me wanting to do it, and could I intervene with another tool? And that's the thing, is you can't abstain from behavior. We live in a world of action. So you have to replace behavior with behavior. And it takes a lot of self-awareness and development of self-awareness to do it. So I eventually was able to replace stealing with writing, which turned into a career. Bizarrely, it wasn't like what I was going for at the time. It was like an amazing side effect of just trying not to steal. So that's one thing. And they're kind of easier to look at, these habit loops. We can all start to name behaviors that aren't good. Maybe rage, maybe you lose your temper, or maybe it's eating, or whatever it is. And you can start to use this little technique to work with that. It's our brilliant, resilient techniques that I think are much trickier to identify. And it wasn't until after I got a grip on the stealing, I was really, really lonely. I was homeless. And I realized I kind of deserved to be lonely because, again, nobody knew me. I hid inside a little notebook. I hid in plain sight. I hid with a smile on my face. I had learned at a young age that being independent was a great survival mechanism. Now, I think that was a natural attribute of mine. I think I was born with sort of a natural independence streak. And I think that we can harvest and use our natural gifts to survive. And that's great. That's what allowed me to move out at 15. Like, who moves out at 15? Only somebody that's kind of naturally really independent. It's why when I was homeless, I stayed away from other kids because they were doing a lot of drugs, and I didn't mind being alone. I didn't mind going my own way. So it served me really well in my life. But when it started to limit my capacity for connection, that's when it no longer is beneficial. So when I realized I was isolated and alone to the point that my safety mechanism was separating me from joy, from humanity, from connection, from happiness, you have a problem. That no longer is something that's working for you, it's working against you. And then you have to go in and look at behavior and go, how do I rework that? And kind of make an actionable commitment, that I have to take action on to start to rework that. And for me, that was sharing what was in my notebook, which was very scary. I remember my show in San Diego, there was 2 people there in this coffee shop. And I decided to sing every brutal song. I just started writing songs. But it wasn't pretty. It wasn't cute. I told the truth. I talked about stealing. I talked about, just everything. And at the end of this 5-hour show of me basically like opening my veins of feeling and just spewing out these poor people, they cried and they were like, I didn't know anybody else felt this way. And I was like, I didn't know anyone else felt this way. We're so oddly, it's a type of arrogance that we think we're the only ones that have our experience. That's such a funny thought because we all have the same organs, we're basically the same. So we're all going to struggle with the exact same things. It's very funny. We think our pain is that special, that nobody else has gone through it. And so learning to have the courage to start to share and use my art as a means of connecting, of vulnerability, of being seen, which was very scary for me. I'm still not a huge fan. Ended up being a powerful stance in life, and again affected my career because I based my career on that prospect so that I never had to lie again.
So that's kind of how it started, is you were willing to open up and be vulnerable to these shows you were playing in San Diego, and built a following that way by just really authentically connecting with your audience. And people started coming, and it just became a whole like kind of snowballing thing, it sounds like.
Yeah, I started singing every Thursday in this coffee shop just to try, and they were going out of business. And I said, would you leave your doors open an extra month? And if I start singing and I can get people to come in, can I keep the door money? And you can keep all the coffee and whatever food and beverage money, which at the time it was hard to find a deal like that in town because it was kind of a big hotbed for signing for grunge. It was, grunge was everything at the time. And so venues wanted you to pay them to play there. And that wasn't what I was going for. I was not trying to get signed. I was just trying to get rent money to get off the street. But it turned into something, like 2 people became 4, became 6, became 20, became, sold out little shows and then 2 shows a night, and then became record labels coming to see me.
And then one of the things I was also struck by your story is um, how conscious you were of like what type of deal you were going to take and what you wanted. You wrote that you were offered $1 million deal and turned it down. And I was just wondering, like, and at the time you were homeless, right? So like, how did you do that? Like, how did you like have the presence of mind of saying like, here's what I want in the long term to like resist, the temptation of just a kind of quick solution?
I think it goes back to kind of the stuff I learned from living off the land when I was young. I was really lucky to be raised in Alaska in nature, because no matter how abusive my household was, I was able to get outside in nature. And nature's a great teacher. Nature taught me how to be human. It parented me. If you watch closely, you learn I just don't know if there's anything you won't learn from nature. Like I remember sitting on the cliffs and seeing the tide coming in and out. I was raised on a bay. I was really sad. And I watched the tide and I was like, everything comes in and out, like nothing's permanent, which isn't a revelation, but it just hit me in the right way that sometimes the tide's just out. And I remember writing that down, and that would become one of the mottos I lived by. It was impermanence. I didn't know that word. I hadn't read that philosophy, but nature taught me impermanence. And that's the beauty of it. Everything changes if you give it enough time. And that helps when you're going through really dark times, because I can't tell you how many times I had to buckle myself in, literally like sit in a seat through a panic attack and go, everything changes if you get enough time. Sometimes the tide's just out. It will always come back in. And people who are suicidal, one of the things they really struggle with is this fixation of permanence. And that one thought really helped me through incredible dark times, because it has to change. It's physics. Everything has to change. It's entropy. I mean, really. And watching trees, I realized that hardwood grows slowly, and it lasted a long time. And I was like, I want to be that. How do you be a hardwood tree? And that goes back to there's no shortcuts. The only genuine shortcut is through. The only genuine shortcut is doing the work. And because I already kind of had these, I'd say, life mottos, like things I wanted to live by, like hardwood grows slowly, that by the time I got to the record deal, even though I was 18, I read a book called Don Passenheim's Everything You Need to Know About the Music Business. I got it out of the library, and I learned how the deals were structured, and it was a loan. And once I figured that out, all you have to do is plug that into your value system, or my value system, which was there's no shortcut. The idea of a homeless kid getting $1 million as a folk artist at the height of grunge, I mean, it doesn't spell success. That doesn't spell life's going to be easy forever. That spells tremendous pressure to me. It spelled borrowing money that I owed back, which you do. It's an advance, and you owe it back through record sales. That meant I had to sell so many records that I not only covered the cost of what it took to promote it, but I then had to sell enough to recoup $1 million before I would ever see any more money. It was like having $1 million bounty on my head. And I couldn't handle that type of pressure. If art is like your baby, you have to protect your baby and do right by it. You don't leverage your baby for $1 million. Like that just doesn't seem like a great idea. And I wanted a long-term career. I didn't want $1 million. I wanted a 60-year career. And again, that's a hardwood grows slowly mentality. And that means you have to do the work. You have to figure out long-term plans that hopefully put you in a position to realize a very long-term goal.
And so you kept your footprint pretty small and lightweight. Like you didn't even move into a house at first, right? You just kind of grinded shows and worked on your music. And I remember you wrote in your book that you basically kept your overhead light so that you couldn't be cut by the music label. And that really worked for you to like really grow this, get the time to develop your fan base. Is that how it happened?
Yeah. I turned down the money, but I did ask them to pay rent on an apartment for my mom and my brother and I. I bought a used car, bought her a used car, and then kept my expenses low, and I made this record. It was a folk record. Again, because I had learned that honesty is the most important thing, my authenticity. I really loved artists. I had heroes of artists that did that. Anais Nin, her journals are incredible. I remember reading them at a really young age, but being so touched that she was so honest. I mean, it's not a cute life she led. She was having affairs with people. She was cheating on her husband. I mean, she wrote about all of it. And I was so thankful that somebody told the truth. Same with Bukowski. I found that heroic because most people use art as propaganda. You see it with success too. You see very successful CEOs that are very invested in keeping the image that they have it all together. Well, nobody has it all together. So you're forcing yourself into a position of being found out and trying to hide so you're not found out. That's a tremendous psychological strain, so the artists that are trying to be perfect and perfectly beautiful and perfectly happy end up, you just succumb to the weight of trying to uphold a complete myth because nobody is. So I wanted to make this really honest record. It was a folk record. I didn't have much of a band on it because I didn't know how to play with a band. I didn't want fancy producers to come to make me sound more experienced than I was, because that would be a lie. And I knew I had it. I knew I was in for a rough ride because Nirvana and Soundgarden were everything. And I was very earnest. I was very sincere. I was talking about hope. I was talking about the fact that, all right, I don't want to kill myself. That means I have to believe in something. That's scary because cynicism is the most cowardly, easy out you can have. And frankly, there's no true cynic alive. They've killed themselves. So all a living cynic is somebody that's pretending, and in order to make themselves less vulnerable. You're hiding it. And so I went out bald-faced optimist, bald-faced realist, but hopeful and fighting for that hope because I was fighting to stay alive, and you don't stay alive without it. And it was a rough road. And so I never got a tour bus. I always had a rental car. I did 5 and 6 shows a day. I was opening for punk bands and the Ramones and keeping my expenses very low, which ended up really paying off because the record failed. It just tanked. It did not do a single thing for over a year. And I definitely would have been dropped, hands down, for sure.
Wow. There's so much in there I want to talk about, like the vulnerability. Like I agree with you 100% that like it's so many people mask their they're not vulnerable, right? And they kind of have this, it's like endemic in the startup world. It's like everybody's like always doing well and crushing it. And it was when I was living like that, it was exhausting. I was constantly comparing myself to other people. I was constantly thinking I'm not doing well enough, but I have to like, I want to really represent that I'm doing like amazingly. And it was only much later in life that I realized I should just be honest about my experience. Like, here's what's going well, here's what's going terribly. Like, here are the mistakes I've made. And when I started being honest, it was like the easiest thing. It was like this weight was off my shoulders, and I kind of was like, why did I never do this before? And I find that, and people come up to me, they're like, wow, you're so authentic, you're so honest about your experience, thank you. And it's pretty incredible how small of a thing it is and how easy it is once you start just telling your experience as it is, instead of having to represent that it's something that you're not. And I wonder almost like why more people don't do that. It's a hard first step, but it gets easier over time.
Yeah, we've built an entirely artificial structure of a paradigm, an archetype of people pretending they're good, they're happy, and they always knew the answers. And so when a young person comes up in that, they go, if I don't have all the answers, something's wrong with me, because everybody in the system I want to be in says they've always known. And so then they have to pretend, because otherwise they won't get funded, and the fake it till you make it and that whole thing. And it's sad because it's all just an artificial structure. It's not true for one single person. And the more people talk about it honestly, the more they go, oh, I mean, the definition of an entrepreneur, same as a musician. you don't know what you're doing. It's never been done. It's impossible to know what you're doing. It hasn't been done. You're trying to break new ground. You're trying to make something up out of nothing. And that means you spend a lot of time bushwhacking, figuring it out, problem solving. Did I do it right? Going back a few steps, listening. That's a great skill set. It's so valuable. And yeah, the more people talk about it, the more they'll realize, oh, okay, I don't have to know all the answers. I just have to keep listening and trying and figuring it out. It's a messy process.
Yeah, failing is part of the process of being an entrepreneur and probably an amazing artist, I would guess. If you don't
Right.
experiment with things, you're never going to get anywhere new. But I remember this, I always think of this episode of Charlie Rose that I watched like maybe 10 years ago, where the founders of MySpace were on, when MySpace was a thing, they were on Charlie Rose, and he was asking them, oh, did you have this plan from the beginning? Did you know it was going to be this big? And one of them said, yeah, we mapped it out in the very beginning. We wrote everything we were going to do down, and it's gone exactly. That's how it's exactly gone. It's played out like for the past 5 years or whatever. It's been exactly what we wrote down in the beginning. And I was like, there's no way that's possible. Like, I don't believe that at all. I thought that was bullshit. And, it's just like, but I feel like there's this pressure for people to say like, oh, I've got it all figured it out. I've figured it all out from the beginning,
Yeah, it's one of the addictions, the need to know everything, and the need to know the outcome. And let's pretend that is how it worked for them. The reason it failed is because they wanted to stick to a plan. And I don't know these people, but I'm just saying, let's pretend, all the stars aligned and you did, just everything was right place, right time, and it worked out. Nature, is changing, and we have to be adaptable. We have to read the environment. We have to read the weather as it changes. And that's one of the problems with business plans is you can make a business plan. Doesn't mean it's how it's going to play out. And if you're so rigidly fixated on, I can't start a process until I know the end outcome because I'm trying to solve for an end outcome, you're just not going to innovate. It's a much more innovative thing to say, I have to get from point A over there. If you need to know all the answers ahead of time, you're going to build a machine that's already been built. But if you let go of needing to know the outcome and you just stay hyper focused on this process, you might invent a spaceship. You're going to invent something new to solve that problem. It's much scarier because we want to know the outcome before it's done and said, but you're just not going to innovate. It's not going to be great.
I 100% agree. I want to go back to the skills that you were talking about. I realized I skipped over those. You talked about the skills to build awareness and build consciousness about what your behaviors were. Can you talk about like, what those skills are and how you learn them? Maybe a little bit more of something that's actionable for the audience. How did you apply those to your life?
Yeah. So I moved out when I was 15. I knew that statistically kids like me end up repeating the cycle, and I didn't want to be a statistic. And I realized that as much as I got a genetic inheritance, I also got an emotional inheritance, and it gets passed down generation to generation. That's why cycles of abuse stay in families, because it's pretty much as hard as affecting your genetics and turning off and on different genetics, I called it emotional English at the time. I learned an emotional language, and it was 5 billion data points. Love, one word, to me is going to mean a million different things than when you hear that love, because it's going to be based on a million different experiences. The name's arbitrary, right? It's the experience that's actually really important. And what's happened in life is we've become very, very definition oriented, but we're not in the experience of anything. If you want to create change, you have to get out of the idea of something and into the experience of something. It's basically what mindfulness does, but people don't really explain it that way. So when I was 15 and attempting to go, all right, I don't want to end up in an abusive relationship when I grow up, or I don't want to be abusive or get into drugs, etc. How do I create a new emotional language? It was daunting. And I did pretty good. But these panic attacks started happening, I think, when I was about 16, which were very scary. I'd never even heard the word panic attack till I was in my 30s, believe it or not. But I knew I was having these episodes, I guess you would call them, which got very exacerbated when I became homeless. So I'm homeless. I'm having worse panic attacks. I'm getting agoraphobic, and I'm stealing way more. And I'm in the dressing room one day, and I am trying to steal this dress, and I am trying to shove it down my pants, and I see myself in the mirror of this dressing room, and I saw what I looked like. I was a statistic. Like, this ambitious goal when I was 15 of not being a statistic didn't work, even though I really did try. And I avoided a lot of things. I didn't end up on a stripper pole. I guess that was good, but my life still wasn't going really great. And I just realized I would die or end up in jail if I didn't do something. And for some reason, I remembered this quote that happiness doesn't depend on who you are or what you have. It depends on what you think. And I remember being very struck by that and thinking, all right, I don't have anything left but my thoughts. I have to turn my life around one thought at a time. But I was so disassociative and anxietal that I couldn't witness my thoughts in real time. I couldn't. I would try and sit down, and I couldn't even hardly really write in real time about like a present current experience.
Yeah.
And so I thought about it, and I thought, well, I'll just watch my hands, because it's like your thought cooled down, slowed down into action. Every thought has to get actuated by your hands. So I was like, what if I watch my hands for 2 weeks, and I'll take notes, and then maybe I'll figure out what I'm thinking. And so for 2 weeks, I just watched everything my hands did. I still stole. I still, I didn't change behavior yet. At the end of the 2 weeks, I kind of looked through everything I did, and I guess there was a really obvious takeaway. I didn't believe in myself. I no longer thought I could hold a job down or stay healthy long enough. I had bad kidneys to hold a job down. But the much more interesting thing is my anxiety was virtually gone in 2 weeks. It was shocking side effect. It was like discovering, it was just mind blowing. What I had stumbled on was presence, right? I had stumbled on learning how to stop taking the past and project it into the future. And I did it by becoming so obsessed and curious, because I was following my hands around. It forced me to be present. So I kind of stumbled on a mindfulness exercise. And that word around wasn't around at the time, the word, but it felt better. And I noticed my body felt better. And so because I had established writing as this real tool of mine up to that point, I kept writing. I'd make notes. And then I started to notice there's only 2 ways my body feels. My body either feels relaxed and open, or closed and scared. You could say dilated and contracted. And then I realized that's the only 2 states your body can be in. There's a myriad of feelings, emotions, actions, thoughts, but there's only 2 states your body can be in. That was a really cool revelation, because then I started to realize you can't be in 2 states at one time. So I was either always dilated and open or contracted. So then I started taking notes. When I felt open and relaxed, I would ask myself, what was I just thinking, feeling, or doing? And I had 3 columns in my notebook: feeling, thinking, doing. And so I'd write down, I was feeling this, I was thinking this, I was doing this. And I would just do it every single time. And then every time I felt scared, contracted, I would ask, what was I thinking, feeling, or doing? So I had these columns of things that led to dilation and things that led to contraction. And then when I realized you can't be in 2 states at one time, I wanted to see if I was in a tight, contracted state, could I force my system to dilate by participating in something off the list that dilated me? And it worked. I remember the first time I was able to ward off a panic attack. It changed my life to this day. Like, that one moment changed the trajectory of my life, learning I could ward off a panic attack. And I did it with gratitude. And I was on a street corner. I felt a panic attack coming on, which again, it took me months to become present enough to feel the signs of a panic attack coming on. Because just like with the stealing, I'd wake up after it, or in the throes of it during it, or see that it was happening, about to happen, but not being able to stop it. So it's months of work, right? To just gain awareness in one area. But I'd gotten to that point. I felt the panic attack starting to come on. I was on a street corner in Pacific Beach, San Diego. And gratitude had always worked well for me. And so I wonder if I can force myself out of this contracted state by being profoundly grateful. The trick is it can't be a mental thing of like, I'm grateful I'm alive. I'm glad that it can't be a mental exercise. It has to stimulate your entire system where that whole cascade happens. Your whole body and mind are involved. And so I was trying to figure out what the heck I would be grateful for. And the sun was coming through this palm tree and it made this beautiful pattern on me. And I had spent so much time in Alaska as a little girl, staring up at trees, laying on my back at these beautiful lacy patterns. And I was suddenly just transported to that time in my life. And I was moved to tears. I moved to tears now, still thinking about it. I didn't kill myself. I was there. I was still taking up space and I was on that street corner and I was trying to figure it out. And I became so profoundly grateful that I kept trying. And all of a sudden, a half hour must have passed and I hadn't had a panic attack. I was lost in this gratitude. And then it got exciting because you start learning, I affect my life, right? I affect my system. I affect my body. I have influence. And I've been giving away the amount of influence I have by being a victim, by saying somebody else owes me, by saying my childhood was terrible. All true. It doesn't help change your life. So at some point I had to say, okay, nobody's coming for me. I'm coming for me. Nobody owes me anything. I owe myself a lot. What am I capable of? What can I do? How can I affect the situation? And that was just sort of the groundwork of a lot of exercises I started to develop to work with specific things. I call it mindfulness in motion because, again, meditation won't change your life. It helps you build the muscle of awareness, presence. But what are you going to do with that presence? How are you going to change your life? That's when it gets really exciting.
I love that. That's so, it's amazing. It's almost like, reminds me of like Ramanujan inventing calculus by himself, like in an Indian village, like going through and like deriving all of math. You kind of went through this process of, through your own experience, putting yourself in a witness state and being the observer, and then figuring out how to like act skillfully, right? From like all of these different mindfulness concepts, like you went through all the different stages and reprogrammed yourself without any guidance or teachers, just kind of from observing your own mind. That's incredible.
I mean, looking back, it looks a lot tidier because I'm able to sum up a year's worth of stuff. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It was messy and scary, but when you use your body as a barometer and you go, did I feel better or not? Everybody should feel better, or they need to try something different. It isn't working. You're not broken. So coming from this place of going, wait a minute, I've spent my whole life trying to fix myself as if I'm broken. What if nothing's wrong with me? Like, what if something's right with me? What if all this works just fine? I'm just not paying attention in the right way. And you start to use your body as a barometer. Did that help or not? No, it didn't. Let me try something else. Did that help or not? No, it didn't. Did that help or not? My body felt a little better. We all have that ability, and that became my obsession and my fascination was, again, this thing that hit me when I was 15 and I moved out. I didn't get to learn to be happy in my house. That was not a behavior that was around for generations in my bloodlines. Was I screwed? Were kids like me just destined at 15 to live a miserable life? That was a very scary thought. And the idea that, why I started my youth foundation, we started it 18 years ago, was what about all the people that don't have therapy? What about the people that don't have access to therapy? What about people that don't have access to education? What about the people that are in therapy and it isn't working and their life isn't getting better? Are you screwed? Or is there a way to self-reflect and help yourself through a process of does it work or doesn't it, and it can work, like what we do with the kids in our foundation. They don't have therapy. They don't have access to a lot of traditional things, family support groups. And they learn the exact same stuff because we each have the ability, I think, because of nature, all the underlying physics of everything, it's there all the time. You get to access it. The way you come to it might be a different language, your thought process. The way I come to it might be a slightly different language, but we're all tapping into the same thing. And no matter how smart you are, you get to tap into it. It's just that we're constantly taught to look outside of ourselves, look for a guru. Not that they can't be helpful, but it still won't be as radically helpful as if you will dig into your own inner knowing, I guess you would call it.
Yeah, and that's kind of the core precept of Buddhism, right? It's like that if you don't have to take anyone's word for it. You can just look inside you and observe and come to your own realization.
That's nice. I didn't realize that. Yeah, I
Yeah.
buy that. Definitely.
Tell me about the foundation and how, we met because I came to your virtual wellness festival, and I love what you're doing in terms of kind of spreading this message of the things that you've learned and teaching other people. How it seems like it's a big part of your life from the outside. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, somewhere along the line in humanity's evolution, we stopped learning what to do with pain. Life started traumatizing us. Can you say life's more traumatic than, when we were hunter-gatherers? I don't know. I mean, I think probably being chased by mastodons is pretty traumatic. So why is that? If we're the most progressed society that's ever lived, why are we killing ourselves at rates that's unprecedented? Like, do we get to call this progress? I don't know the definition of progress, but we might want to rethink it.
Yeah.
What the heck makes us so advanced? Why do we think we're so progressed and so advanced? When, to me, a really important metric is, are we happy? We're killing ourselves. I mean, right now they're saying 1 in 4 kids are contemplating suicide. 1 in 4? Let's see, between 2006 and 2018, suicide rates had gone up nearly 70%. That's pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
We're missing something. And our desire to be faster, quicker, I don't know, richer, we're missing the things that actually make us feel like we want to be alive. That's a real problem. Somewhere when we left a village system would be my guess. And we began to move and conglomerate into cities. We lost a lot of support structures. We lost access to our wisdom keepers, our medicine men, our healers. And then from earth, right, away from nature, we stopped having a relationship to a lot of things. And we can't value what we don't have a relationship with. Our earth wouldn't be in the state the earth is in if more people had a relationship with nature. If you had a relationship with water, you wouldn't be leaving your faucet on. I hauled water in 5-gallon buckets. It's so flipping heavy. I had a relationship with it and I really valued it in a way that not a lot of people got to, because nobody hauls water. I was super lucky. You complain as a kid that you have to haul water, but what you're doing is you're building a relationship with something. And humans are built to be in connection. We're built to be in relationship. And so if I could summarize all that as saying we went from a species that lived in connection, in relationship, to a species that lived out of connection and out of relationship with ourselves. We find our own feelings very confusing, out of a relationship with our earth, out of a relationship with community, with our parents. It's a breakdown of connection. And it's a society that became very obsessed and invested in distraction. And it's where a lot of our money is made. We make money off of things that distract us. It's very addictive. And then the more pain you get in, you want to be distracted all the more. And so it's this amazing vicious cycle. So when I was going through my divorce at 40, I thought, can I figure out how to scale connection? Can I figure out how to scale wisdom? Can I try and figure out how to help people with, if it looks complex because you have Me Too and gun violence and opioid addiction and nationalism and racism and all these things. They look like separate things, but if you really study it, they all come down to mental health, emotional health, and connection. Because if you're connected and living in your heart, as dumb as it sounds, you're not going to leverage a coworker. You're not going to let yourself be leveraged by a coworker. If you're in connection with yourself and you have a good emotional health, you're not going to litter where you're living. You're not going to beat somebody up. You're not, all these things get fixed. It's just not a magic pill. But I started to see if I could develop systems to try and basically scale wisdom, scale connection. And I want to do it for every age demographic if I can. So working on a mindfulness cartoon for children that teach kids a little value toolkit and that solves problems by taking 3 deep breaths, becoming the observer, and then applying a value to it and tackling that problem. The Wellness Festival is that we're trying to democratize information of what it takes to be a happy whole human. Because in my house, I was taught to be a singer. That's what my family did. My friend's house, they were all serial entrepreneurs. He was taught to be a business person. But we're like trees. We have root systems, we have branches. We're a whole system. And so if all you do is have a limb that sings, well, that's going to be an impressive limb if that's all you show people, right? But all my other limbs of mental health, emotional health, physical fitness, medical fitness, etc., intimacy fitness, parenting fitness, if those are atrophied, your life is not harmonious. It's painful. And you try and keep doubling down on your arm that's good at singing because that makes you feel good about yourself. And you keep letting these atrophy. And so creating these whole human systems is what I'm attempting to do, like with the Wellness Festival, with the Youth Foundation, creating a culture company for businesses so they can help employees invest in sort of this whole human education, because I believe it'll make them more engaged, less sick days, more loyal, a lot more bandwidth to show up and be creative and innovate at work. And yeah.
That's a beautiful mission. I love that. One last thing I wanted to ask you about was forgiveness. I loved in your book that you had been through these experiences with your father growing up, being abusive, and then your mother stealing money from you when you were, as you kind of made it as a singer. But you seem to write, like, one thing you wrote, I wrote it down because I liked it so much. That you one thing you wrote about your dad is that you have so much compassion for your dad. And I was struck by, most people who go through these experiences would be like, very resentful, harboring a lot. And it seemed like you were able to release it all and have a relationship, actually build a relationship with your father who, and kind of move on. And I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about kind of forgiveness and being able to release all of the trauma that you had experienced when you were younger.
Yeah, it's a big topic. It's a beautiful topic. I'm trying to think of where to begin because it's, years of process and then different types of things and tools, but I can't say I understood the word compassion my entire life. I don't think I've been a very compassionate person either, in all honesty. It wasn't something I was raised around, and it wasn't something I was with myself either. I pushed myself real hard my whole life, push, beat myself up, I'd honestly say compassion is something I'm just now starting to understand, and I'd love to talk about it, but I might put it toward the end of some other stuff. But if I forget, help me remember.
Yeah.
I have always been competitive. I kind of like to win. It's just kind of part of my personality. That can either really work for you or really become a problem. Luckily, I started to learn to be competitive with myself. to do my best work. And it's a really private race, only you know when you're doing it. There's been times in my career when I was told I was a sellout, but I knew I wasn't. To me, selling out would have been doing You Were Meant for Me, point 2 and point 3. The world would have thought I was staying authentic. But for how I'm wired, I like doing new things. That's how authentic to me. So I had to do pop music and I had to do country music. That wasn't selling out. Now the whole world perceived it differently. But in my competition, in my head, in the race I was running, that was me doing my best to win that race, right? To live up to whatever I thought my potential was.
Yeah.
The reason I'm talking about competitiveness is the best revenge is a life well lived. If you really want to get back at other people, figure out how to be happy. It's the most radical thing you can do. It's the best booyah. It's the best in your face, it's the best. I know that sounds kind of funny, but how do I describe it? It was like when you're abused as a kid, you internalize your abuser, right? I no longer had my dad to deal with, but I internalized his voice, the self-abuse, the meanness, the nastiness, the watching every little thing. I became that person in my head and I treated myself that way. And so it's like getting abused twice. When you live with bitterness forever, when you let somebody's betrayal, like my mom, if I let that make me bitter the rest of my life, that's letting that win. And that might sound like a weird way to say it, but if you become bitter, you've lost. If you have lost the capacity to love, you lost. I have to define winning as being more loving, more kind, more open. Now, not dumb, not naive. We must become more discerning to avoid these things from happening again. But I have to become a more exceptional person for all this to make sense. I kind of don't know how to, it makes forgiving easier. Because in order for you to let go of the bitterness, let go of the anger, you're going to have to cut your ties to it. And what a grudge does, right? The opposite of forgiveness is a grudge or a resentment. What that does is pretend it's a balloon and pretend my mom betraying me is a balloon. It's a red balloon. I would love to disassociate from that balloon, right? I'd love to no longer have to deal with that balloon. But the more I fixate on it and I say, that balloon's the enemy, that balloon is the worst thing that's ever happened, that balloon is the incarnate of the devil, I'm fixating on it. What it does is keep me in relationship to it. Coming back to relationship, my anger and my resentment keep me in a relationship to what I say I want to be free from. Does that mean I really want to be free from it? Or is that just some false baloney? Because I seem very invested in wanting to keep my relationship with it. The very frightening thing about forgiveness is it takes you out of relationship with it. That's really scary, especially if it's a parent, because psychologically, letting a parent go by forgiving them, your psyche knows what's up. Your psyche knows you're about to cut that string. And I want nourishment. Every human does. Every human wants energy to be fed. And if we can't get it through love and positivity, we'll get it through negativity and abuse. And so when you cut that, you're cutting your relationship to it. That's why most people don't want to forgive. Because if you forgive the person that hurt your child, you're left no longer being able to fixate on this bad thing. You don't have to deal with your feelings. You don't have to deal with everything you're going through. And it's a mess. It's not like a cute thing to stop focusing on the balloon and look inside yourself and go, this is kind of a shit show in here. But it's the first step to being able to deal with the shit show so that you can then let go of the anger and those things so that you can then go on to saying, what kind of person do I want to become? So I call forgiveness the needle that knows how to mend. It's repurposing that thread that connected you to something hurtful and using it to start sewing up your own little wounds. And it's beautiful. Because anything less is burning down your own house to get rid of rats. You're not going to become a happy person by hanging on to it. The thing is, people confuse forgiveness with condoning. And this is where we start to get into compassion a little bit. People think if I forgive my dad, it means I have to say what he did was good. That's a whole separate thing. That's like saying an apple is an orange. Those are two different topics. One doesn't have anything to do with the other. What my dad did wasn't fun, didn't mean I got my needs met. But trauma is a body's inability to understand, right? Trauma, if we just want to get super simple about it, is an experience that's so overwhelming, we don't know how to understand it. And so we hang on to it. It becomes sort of cemented into our psyche and begins to affect our nervous system, have these really long-term effects. So to start to understand is to start to unwind trauma. And there's all kinds of tools and exercises that I developed around it. But what compassion does is create space. It's a container. We need containers to begin to have room to understand. So with my dad, as I began to learn about his childhood, the absolute horrors of his childhood, that man did so much better with me than was done with him. Now, again, that doesn't mean I'm condoning it. It doesn't mean it was enough. It doesn't mean my needs got met. It doesn't mean it wasn't scary. That's a whole separate topic. What it does mean is I can start to understand it. That starts to alleviate trauma. That starts to, it doesn't make the story of my childhood different, right? The facts, but how I interpret that story changes. And that's very empowering, because now it means the story used to be my dad didn't love me. The truth is my dad didn't know how to love me. Now that'll shift the trajectory of somebody's life. If I had understood that younger, I would have made different decisions, because I no longer would have thought I am unlovable. My dad doesn't love me because I am unlovable. I better start changing who and what I am. It starts to make you go, oh my gosh, my dad doesn't know how to love. I need to go figure out how to be loved by somebody that's capable, or from myself. So all that to say, compassion, what I've really come to realize about it is it just creates space. And if the world is in need of one thing right now, it's just some compassion and some understanding. We're so invested in trying to be heard that we're not creating any compassion. And that's the problem with cancel culture, is it doesn't allow change. And you have to ask yourself, do I want to beat somebody up, or do I want to help somebody change? Because you don't get both. So cancel culture has a false belief that says, if I cancel you, if I deny you any kind of air to breathe, relationship, basically, I'm saying I'm going to not afford you relationship, then I think it'll change your behavior. Well, it doesn't. It makes people more entrenched in their behavior, more scared, more traumatized, more bigoted, whatever it is. If you actually want to change something, you have to create space. You have to try and understand. And compassion really, at the end of the day, just means I'm willing to sit here, create some space, and try to understand you. It's the most flattering thing you can do, is come into relationship with somebody, to come into harmony with them. And from there, you start to see what can happen. But it doesn't mean just because you're affording somebody a container of space that you agree that they should be racist. It just means you start to try and understand what made them the way they are. What are they passionate about? And in America, we have such a tremendous opportunity that I hope the DNC seizes, that I think we missed with the Tea Party, to go, who are you? You're clearly really passionate. You clearly care. What is it that you care so much about? I'd like to understand you more. If we can't come into a relationship to the things that make us uncomfortable, they get stronger. It's called the wicked teacher. That which you resist, you become. And that's why you see these radical leftists acting exactly like radical rightists. Mean, judgmental, harsh, canceling, rigid, all the exact same attributes, just, manifesting in slightly different ways. I went off on a tangent.
No, that's great. I actually had thought about that earlier when you talked about resilience, and kind of learning to be resilient. It's like a lot of our internet culture now is kind of very fragile. Actually, we don't want to hear things that make us uncomfortable. We want to push them away or cancel them or shout them down. And that really the problem with that, right, is that it's actually making us less resilient to like be able to be in situations that may be triggering and be able to sit with that and be like, oh, I'm uncomfortable. Like, why is that? Or maybe I'm learning something myself, or even just being able to sit with that discomfort, which is not, like you said, it's like not that we condone those actions or what those other people are saying. It's just that, you're always, the human experience is like, you're going to have uncomfortable situations, or you're going to have, be in uncomfortable environments. And if we kind of train ourselves to be fragile, then we're going to be fragile. If we train ourselves to be resilient, then we'll be able to kind of be in that full human experience. And I think about that a lot, actually. I wonder and I worry about that, because I think we're, as a society, kind of moving in this direction of fragility.
We're making ourselves very precious. We're
Yeah.
precious. And that isn't what we want. It's not going to help us. It's not why humanity got where humanity is, right? We didn't get here by being more precious. We got here by being more resilient. So then you get to start looking really fun things like, what is the definition of resilience? I go back to nature, grew up in a forest. A forest is resilient. Why is a forest resilient? It has biodiversity, right? If there's a flood, there's plants that are going to do well in a flood. If there's a drought, there's plants that are going to do well in a drought. It's a diverse ecosystem. What we started doing as a species is becoming a monoculture. There is no natural system on the planet that is a monoculture. It doesn't work. Every ecosystem is a highly diverse system. And so when we have monoculture of thought, it's very dangerous. And you also then realize it's the only thing you got. So you better double down on it. And you become even more rigid and invested in that one thing and being right in it, which makes us much more fragile. So fragility is a lack of multiple skill sets. It's a lack of diversity in thought. And what's kind of interesting is, a lot of people say they want tolerance. They might even write that down as one of their values, but they don't want to be tolerant. They want to be tolerated, which basically is just a fragility masquerading as an altruistic virtue. But it isn't. It's just saying, I'm a monoculture. I have one single belief system. I'm unwilling to even think about adapting to any other system. And so I'm going to do everything I can to protect it, which is you have to tolerate me, but I'm not going to tolerate you. And both sides are doing it. It's kind of funny. And then when you look at, again, that fragility of, you have to start looking at, again, what are your goals? We all know our world needs to change. Well, then what's the anatomy of change? The anatomy of change is interesting, right? You have to kind of go back to physics. Energy can never cease to exist. It can only change. It can only become different forms. So if we apply that to human behavior and emotional behavior, what compassion does, creating some space and some container, is saying, I first want to see what energy I'm dealing with. Because how are you going to help an energy change if you don't know what chemical it is? So first, you have to be a little scientist, get a little petri dish out, some space, a container, go, what is it I'm working with? Sincerely, you have to really get to know it. What is it? What is the nature of this? Then it's the very first step to things being able to change. And then you have to go, what does this energy need to shift and become something new? Well, it's a really interesting thing. The anatomy, the physics of change, of creating behavioral change, emotional change, systems of change. It isn't just one quick, simple thing. But what we all have to start doing for ourselves and for other people is starting to create this container. Because I know a lot of Trump supporters. I know, it's funny, people get mad at me. They're like, how can you be friends with so-and-so or X and X? And I'm like, because I'm actually living my value of tolerance and wanting to understand. And that if I can influence somebody, my friendship isn't based on, I'm going to influence and change you, because that'd be futile. But we do start to get to influence one another. I can start seeing the value of what and how they're living, which is very beautiful. And they can start to see mine, and we do start to influence each other. But that's a commitment to a relationship. And none of that gets to happen when you cancel people. It just doesn't. It makes you more fragile. It makes them more fragile, and makes both people go back into entrenched behavior. And it isn't working. So anytime, you see anybody canceling anybody, or you have the urge to, because I still have that urge of like, F you. Now, that isn't to say there aren't boundaries. Compassion doesn't mean there's no boundaries. I have all kinds of boundaries. If you're a racist, we can't roll. You can like Trump. I don't have a problem, but I can't be friends with somebody who's a racist or somebody who condones violence or whatever that is. We still get our boundaries. And that's, again, just a really different topic from compassion.
I love that commitment to connecting across differences. It's like being in relationship with people who are outside of you or like different from you. That's what's going to kind of create that diversity of thought, right? And that resilience, and bring us together as a society in a way that maybe we're diverging from. That's a beautiful, sentiment and place to, I love that. I love that idea.
Right on. Yeah. I mean, the smartest plants, the smartest creatures are the ones that learn and adapt from other creatures.
Oh.
And it's a fun way to live, for sure.
Cool. Well, Jewel, that's what I had. I really appreciate you having this conversation with me. It's a lot of
Yeah,
fun.
I really enjoyed it.
I feel like I learned a lot.
Yeah, likewise. Really fun.